The U.S. election is shaping up to be the most consequential in recent history. What will this election mean for the future of the United States? And what will the impact be on the rest of the world? You're about to find out. I'm Joanna Rotenberg, Group Head of BMO Wealth Management, and on behalf of everyone at BMO, we're proud to support the Globe and Mail U.S. Election Dialogues. These webcasts bring together some of the most seasoned professionals in policy, politics, and journalism in a series of live discussions and debates on this election. It's going to be a great event. Today's discussion is on the global economic response to the 2020 U.S. election. And to give us an in-depth perspective on this is American business leader, venture capital investor, the former director of the National Economic Council, and the former president and chief operating officer of the Goldman Sachs Group, Inc., Gary Cohn. We're glad you could join us. Enjoy the event.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to part 2 of the Globe and Mail's U.S. Election Dialogues. I'm Rita Tritcher, senior business writer and columnist for the Globe and Mail. I'm thrilled to be here today as your interviewer and host. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items to attend to. As mentioned, this is the second in a series of 3 U.S. election dialogues that the Globe and Mail and BMO have partnered in hosting. Event number 1, which was broadcast on October 1st, featured the Globe and Mail's international affairs columnist, Doug Saunders, in conversation with renowned presidential historian Doris Kearns Goodwin. The full interview is now available for viewing online. Coming up on October 29th is the 3rd event in this series, which will be a panel featuring the Washington Post's Bob Woodward of Watergate fame, and author of the recent headline-grabbing book, Rage. Bob will be in conversation with PBS NewsHour's anchor and managing editor, Judy Woodruff, as well as the Globe and Mail's Ottawa bureau chief, Robert Fife. The discussion will focus on the challenges of reporting on the 2020 election and the role of today's journalists in the democratic process. It will be moderated by the Globe's Washington-based correspondent, Adrian Morrow. We also received many audience questions for our featured guest today, and will strive to answer as many as possible closer to the end of our discussion. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our featured guest. Gary Cohn is an American business leader, venture capital investor, and the former director of the U.S. National Economic Council. Mr. Cohn served as the chief economic advisor to President Donald Trump from January 2017 until April 2018. In this role, he managed the administration's economic policy and led its efforts to grow the U.S. economy, create jobs, and oversee tax and regulatory reforms. Mr. Cohn began his career in finance at Goldman Sachs in 1990. He eventually served as its president and chief operating officer from 2006 to 2016. Today, I'm pleased to have Mr. Cohn join me to discuss the economic implications of the 2020 U.S. election, both for the United States and the global economy at large. Please welcome Gary Cohn. Hello, Gary.
Hello, Rita. Thanks for having me. That was a great introduction.
Thanks for joining us today. Really looking forward to hearing your insights. I want to start off by asking you how you would rate the U.S. government's response so far to this economic crisis.
Well, Rita, before we talk about the economic crisis, we really have to talk about how we got here. You know, the economic crisis was a function of trying to fight a pandemic, fight this COVID-19 virus that we're all dealing with. You know, the US government in March made a decision to shut down the US economy because they thought that was in the best interest of all of the US citizens, as well as maybe the world. They were trying to stem the flow of the virus and trying to create a healthier world for all of us. In doing that, we did shut down the economy. But I remind people, we made a very conscientious choice to shut down the economy. And I think at the time the decision was made, most people thought it was going to be for a relatively short period of time. Once it was clear that it was going to go for a bit longer, I think Congress, as well as the White House, justifiably started to throw more and more fiscal stimulus at the problem, understanding that workers were going to be detached from their businesses longer and longer. So I think we've got to remember the economy started in a great place in early March. We threw it into this tailspin, and the government's been trying to throw stimulus at it to try and help it recover.
Have we seen the worst of this crisis, or do you think the U.S. economy requires more stimulus?
I think that's going to be a function of how quickly we can get COVID-19 under control. And unfortunately, none of us really know the answer. What I think, and I preface this by thinking, because we're all worried right now as we get into the fall season and we get colder and colder temperatures, we are seeing more of the COVID-19 come back. But what I think is we are dramatically smarter in the medical world. The medical community understands the virus substantially better. We understand how to fight it. We're understanding socially distancing. We're understanding masks. We're understanding washing our hands. We're understanding how to run a socially distant economy. We also have the stimulus that has been thrown into the economy. So I would like to think, and I am pretty optimistic, that the worst of the economy is behind us. That said, I don't think it's a instantaneous real-time recovery. We still have the vast majority of large businesses shut down because people are not willing to go into their offices and they can't ride in elevators and they can't be in densified floors. And then you look at the whole travel, leisure, entertainment, and hospitality business. That business is a long way from coming back to anything close to where it was early in the year.
You raised a lot of good points. There are a lot of challenges ahead. In your view, what needs to happen from here on out? Now, I realize a lot of this depends on who wins the next election, but what do you think the economic priorities of the next U.S. president ought to be?
So Rita, look, I think there's one really important issue that we have to deal with. What we've seen, we've seen this quite obviously, is when the government decided to shut down the U.S. economy, the government made a decision of who is essential and who is not essential. And again, I'm not going to criticize this. I think it's very hard to go back and criticize because we were fighting this huge unknown pandemic. So they decided what businesses were essential. And they said, you essential businesses, you stay open, you serve the consumers. And by the way, the consumers needed to be served. We needed to buy food. We needed to buy medicine. We needed to buy essentials. And all you businesses that don't deliver essential products to the consumers, we're going to shut you down because we want to keep as many people home and as safe as possible. So the largest companies got larger and larger in the United States and continue to get more and more market share. Now the smaller companies that sell many of the exact same products that those large companies were selling the entire time, they're trying to get back to business. And it's very tough to compete against someone who never slowed down or never stopped. It's very tough to compete when you're reopening your business, you're rehiring people, and you're trying to lure your clients back. So the most important thing I think the government can do, and we've done some of this, and we started with the PPP program, and we're going to have to try other programs like that, is we're going to have to get the small businesses going again. I remind everyone that small businesses account for more than 50% of the jobs in America, and they account for more than 50% of the economic growth. But those small businesses were the ones that took the real brunt of the economic shutdown. They were deemed non-essential. So we are going to have to figure out how to get small businesses up and going again if we want any hope of a real sustained economic recovery.
You're right. Small businesses were really hammered during this crisis. I'm wondering how dependent is the U.S. economic recovery on the availability of a COVID-19 vaccine?
Well, we'd love to have a vaccine. I think everyone would love to have a vaccine yesterday. And there are many pharmaceuticals around the world working independently and uniquely working together, trying to solve the vaccine issue. And I think we're all hoping, and in fact, we're probably all praying that we end up with some type of vaccine. I don't know how quickly that can happen, but it would clearly be a help. That said, I think we have to live and we have to manage our economy every day without a vaccine. And if we get a vaccine, that's just a bonus on top. So the virus is running its normal course. We'll continue to see it run its normal course. We'll continue to get smarter how to live with the virus. But many of these businesses that are really based on densification, and the travel and leisure hospitality business is one that really is based on densification. I don't care if it's an airplane or a sports arena or a movie theater. That's a place where you're used to going and there being a lot of people. Those are businesses that are going to have a tough time coming back without a vaccine. So look, we will get the economy only so far into the recovery without people feeling comfortable being densified. Obviously, the vaccine would catapult that to a whole new level.
Do you think most Americans will take a vaccine once it's widely available? And if they don't, is that a risk to the economic recovery?
So the polling on this has moved dramatically over time. And I think it's very hard for people to give you an honest answer about will they take a vaccine when one's not available. My point of view would be, look, a lot of people will take it. And then what you'll see is those people that take that vaccine, hopefully, if the vaccine is as effective as we think it will be, they will be able to re-engage in their normal lifestyle. They'll be able to go to events, they'll be able to travel, they'll be able to engage in their office, they'll be able to engage with friends and colleagues and socialize. And the people that don't, they'll be isolated. I don't think people want to stay isolated. So I think there's going to be enormous pressure on people to continue to take the vaccine because they feel like they're socially being left behind, but they're also being left behind in their career development. You know, if you've got an office where 2/3 or half of the people have taken the vaccine and they're sitting in a conference room with a whiteboard trying to solve a big problem for a really important client and you're zoomed in, look, you can be somewhat effective, but you're not going to be nearly as effective as the people that are sitting in that conference room. And as people's careers continue to progress by sitting in that conference room, you're going to say, hey, what am I doing? You know, I really need to get in there and I really need to engage. And I think there's going to be a real quality of life issue for those that don't take the vaccine.
You've already mentioned the need for more support of the small business sector, but what advice would you give to the next president, whether it's Mr. Trump or Mr. Biden, on how to create more jobs?
So this will be the most important task that the next president has, whomever he will be. You know, we entered this pandemic with almost record low unemployment numbers. We were about 3.5% unemployment. Most people would consider that full employment in the United States. And we had similar situations around the world where there was real employment. We now have a situation where we have, something just short of 10% unemployment in the United States, high single digits unemployment. We have to get workers back to work. But again, we keep going back to these small businesses. We go back to travel, leisure, hospitality, entertainment sectors. Those small businesses have to come online and they have to be able to compete with the large businesses that were never shut down. So I would be a huge advocate for whomever the next president is to get involved with the small businesses, create any incentive and every incentive you can. The PPP program was a really good program because it's really important for small businesses to keep their employees attached, meaning the employees of the small business, they knew where they worked. They knew if we were able to turn the economy back on, they didn't have to go out and look for a new job. They weren't wondering who their employer was. They knew who their employer was, and the government was helping you make payroll. Now people have become unattached. So even if we start reopening small businesses, and unfortunately, over half the small businesses in the United States have gone out of business, so we'd have to start new small businesses, then people have to start looking for jobs with those small businesses. So A, we have to create new small businesses. B, we have to incentivize the small businesses that exist. We can do some of that on the federal level by giving out federal money, but also we can do some of that on the state level. We can give small businesses a competitive advantage versus the national businesses, and you can do that in a variety of different ways. You can say, hey, look, if you go to a small business in your neighborhood, you don't have to pay sales tax. If you go to a national business and you buy the same product, you have to pay sales tax. Yes, it may put the national business at a disadvantage for some period of time, but I'll revert back to March when you had a huge advantage because you were the only one open.
I have to ask you about the stock market. Is there a disconnect between US stock indexes and the real economy, or is it just me?
No, again, remember the stock market is a market of stocks. So when we look at these indices, and it doesn't matter what index you look at, they all have a calculation methodology. Some are driven by market cap, some are driven by price. There's some way to calculate what the value of a market index is. And what's going on in the last 7 months is, again, the largest companies have gotten significantly larger because they have become more and more important in our lives, because they provided the goods and the services that we needed throughout the virus nonstop, and they did it every day. And so we became more and more dependent on those companies. It doesn't matter if they were providing goods or services or technology or deliveries. We needed them more and more than we ever did. So those companies got bigger and bigger. And so they drove the value of the indices. As I remind people, the indices are really heavily weighted to the bigger companies. If we had an index of the smallest market cap companies, or in there, I think you would see a completely different market index. Or if we had an index of small regional businesses or family-owned businesses or minority-owned businesses, I think that index would be trading at a substantially different price than the stock market. The stock market is representing the value of the largest, most important companies in the world today.
So let's pivot a bit here and talk about central banking. Obviously, we've seen central banks around the world, including the Fed, take more extraordinary actions during this crisis. But how do you think these central banks, including the Fed, need to approach the great unwinding of these asset purchase programs? I mean, that is the eventuality, is it not?
Look, eventually we will unwind. But again, let's think of where we were. When this COVID virus started in March, the Federal Reserve was still unwinding their balance sheet from 2008. So 12 years later, they were still unwinding a balance sheet. I don't think anyone should be thinking about the unwind of the balance sheet of the largest central banks in the world. They will at some point stop buying assets, stop intervening in the markets for a long period of time before they even think of unwinding their balance sheet. There'll be a natural runoff of assets. There'll be a discussion, do they reinvest coupons? Do they reinvest principal that runs off? They'll probably do that for some period of time. That's what they did in 2008. And then there'll be a discussion about how do they start shrinking their balance sheet. And they'll be very, very methodical about it. Look, I think what the Fed did was very important, and we shouldn't underestimate how important it was, not only for the Fed, but other central banks around the world in lowering interest rates and providing the liquidity that the markets needed, so everyone was comfortable that there was massive liquidity in the system and the system would continue to operate very efficiently.
Do you think we should be bracing for negative interest rates in the US? And what would the impacts be if that were to occur?
So I'm not a big fan of negative interest rates. I don't think the Fed is a big fan of negative interest rates. It's not something that's in my forward forecast, and I don't think we are going to see them. I think we've seen rates fairly low, and we continue to see rates low right now with a 10-year in the 70 basis point area and a 30-year rate in 170, 180 basis point area. Those are significantly low interest rates. And I think that's an area where the Federal Reserve is comfortable. I don't think the Federal Reserve is comfortable with negative interest rates. Remember, there's a flip side of low interest rates that I think people miss sometimes. We have always taught our citizens around the world that when you do your family planning and you do your estate planning, the older you get, you de-risk your portfolio and you put more money into secure, safe, interest-bearing securities, especially government bonds. And right now, the return that older population is getting from the interest rates is not enough to sustain them. So remember, there is a negative consequence to lowering interest rates for savers and elder populations.
So no one predicted the economic fallout from this pandemic. I'm wondering if central banks need to rethink their risk models. Do we need to rethink what constitutes risk?
Well, I think central banks are always
reevaluating their risk models, as all banks are. Commercial banks are always reevaluating their risk models. Central banks are always reevaluating their risk models. One thing that we know the banking and central banking industry is good at, they're good at modeling the last crisis. It's unusual for a central bank or a bank not to change their models relatively quickly once they go through a crisis. So after the 2008 crisis, every bank and central bank remodeled for mortgages and mortgage exposure and how much volatility could be in a mortgage and how much the principal could decline. I think every bank and every central bank will now model for what we know of this pandemic. It doesn't mean that the next pandemic or the next crisis will look like this crisis, but it does mean that the central banks of the world and commercial banks of the world will now have a new set of concepts, looking at global pandemics or global crises that they didn't have in their models before, and they will have to think about that. So every time we go through one of these events, it will and it should have an impact on the way these risk managing organizations and these regulatory organizations think about how they should look at their own balance sheet and the balance sheet of those that they regulate.
Okay, now for a really thorny question. Should the U.S. embark on tax reform, both for personal taxes and also corporate taxes? What's your view?
So really, this is a good question. It's not thorny at all to me. So when you look where we are right now in the United States, and I could talk about another country, we now have learned over the course of 2020 that the federal government, basically on a bipartisan vote, has voted to put $3+ trillion of stimulus into the US economy. And they may vote before the year's over to put additional stimulus in. So we now know that at any given moment in time, the federal government has to be prepared to write a multiple trillion-dollar stimulus check. I think that's a whole new input into the way the federal government should look at both the revenue side of their equation and the expense side of their equation. So when I look at this COVID-19 crisis and the impacts that it should have and the long-term impacts, one of them that I believe it should have is Washington should get together and once and for all look at their financial house. And by that I mean they need to look at how they spend money and how they collect money. And they need to do that with the knowledge that at any moment in time, we could have to inject trillions of dollars into the system for fiscal stimulus. And I think that's really important. And we've never really done that. And we've never really been able to look at the expense side of the equation. We tend to only look at the revenue side of the equation. I think coming out of this, we are going to have changes in tax laws. I think it's inevitable, but I would also hope that we would have changing in the spending side of the equation as well.
Okay, I wanted to ask you about globalism. You've been called a globalist, and a lot has been written in the press in the United States and in Canada and around the world about the death of multilateralism, the death of globalism. What do you see as the future of globalism?
Well, look, I am a globalist. I consider myself a globalist, and I think the global nature of the world is for the betterment of all of us. And I do think this exchange and trade, the exchange of ideas, exchange of knowledge, exchange of citizens, exchange of goods, exchange of everything is for the betterment of the world. And so it does have to be it does have to be fair, it does have to be free, it does have to be open. There does have to be some rules in that basis. But I am always been an advocate for allowing countries to play to their strength and then getting what they don't need from another country. So, Canada and the United States tend to trade with each other. We at the end of the year, it's pretty balanced what we trade with each other. We produce things in the United States that they don't produce in Canada and vice versa, and then we trade with each other. And that's a good balance of trade, and both countries benefit from that. China, which everyone picks on, and I'm sure you'll ask me something about this, they tend to produce goods that are relatively cheaper, and I don't mean cheaper in quality, they can produce them less expensively than people can in North America. So we tend to import more of those goods from China, which I think is a big win for North America because we actually produce services in the United States. So if our citizens in North America can buy cheaper imported goods, they have more disposable income to buy domestically produced services. So that to me is a win-win. So if I'm spending less money on a good, I can go out and spend more money on going to a restaurant or getting my hair cut or going to the dry cleaners or any of those services that are domestically produced here. And so both economies win. And I do believe at the end of the day, if we allow economies to leverage their competitive advantage, that's a good thing. Now, there is something that we have also learned in 2020. I think 2020 has been one of the most educational years when you will look back at it in our modern being. I do think that countries now do have to look at their domestic resiliency. You know, historically, we've looked at our national security, we've looked at our border security, we've looked at all of those things. But I don't think any country in the United States and North America has not done as good a job at looking at their domestic resiliency. By that I mean, in times of stress and times of strain, and we clearly were in stress and strain in March of April this year, how resilient are we as a country? How well can we take care of ourselves? You know, there were times when we were running short or running out of personal protective equipment. There were times when we were running short of ventilators. We weren't able to get certain drugs into the country. People were worried about the food supply because of the virus. Those are issues that I don't think we can ignore long term. I do think we have to think about ourselves as a country in America or North America as a whole, because I think Canada and the United States play into this very complementary. How do we make sure that we're resilient as a country and that we can take care of ourselves in times of stress?
Does that mean bringing some of the supply chain capacity back onshore?
It may. It may mean bringing some supply chain capacity onshore. And look, I'm for that. It may mean having a better infrastructure and making sure your infrastructure doesn't shut down. It may mean having better stockpiles of things, if that's what the decision is. There's a bunch of answers. I'm not qualified right now sitting here by myself to tell you what the right answer is. But having more manufacturing of things that we may deem essential to the well-being of the country, that may be part of the answer. It may be part of the answer to bring back manufacturing of things that we deem essential.
Okay, so let's talk about China. You did reference China earlier. Obviously, there are huge trade tensions between the U.S. and China. Obviously, China's having issues, with other countries, including Canada, India, Australia. What is China's role in the new world order, as I like to call it? And, what is the future of U.S.-China relations after this election?
So I think China-U.S. relationships is one of the potential items where we could see some change. Although, both presidential candidates, the president and the presidential candidates, seem to be more aligned on China. That seems to be an issue where they are more aligned and they are concerned about the role China plays. And there are some real issues dealing with China. Yes, I'm a globalist, but as I said, free and fair is really important in this discussion. So look, we don't want the Chinese stealing intellectual property. We don't want them taking things from the United States or from North America whatsoever. We want them paying for these things. And then the flip side is when North American companies go over to China, we want them treated the way we treat their companies here. So it's got to be reciprocal. It's got to be free. It's got to be fair. And I think both the president and the presidential candidates, they are thinking that way. That said, we in North America import a lot of goods from China. We import some very important goods from China. And we don't really have a secondary supply chain for a lot of those goods. And so if we wanted to stop buying things from China, it would take many, many years to stop that purchasing. We would have to either build the infrastructure here ourselves to manufacture those goods, or we'd have to wait till some other country in the world built the manufacturing necessary to build that. So a really interesting topic to talk about is a lot of the medications that we take here. A lot of the medicines and medications that are consumed in North America are manufactured in China. They have invested in that technology, they've invested in that infrastructure, and they supply North America. If we want to take back the production of those medications, whether they're life-saving crucial or they're non-life-saving crucial medications, it would take some time, and I've heard different estimates based on different medicines. Some are up to 5, 6, 7 years for us to actually build out and create the cultures and create the manufacturing back here in North America. So we're going to be dependent on China for some period of time for those goods. And like I said, we may benefit from that because the cost of the goods that we're importing are lower than the price we can get them anywhere else, which means that Americans have more disposable income. The one issue, and this is an issue that I have disagreed with before, is I don't really believe in tariffs at the border. I think tariffs at the border become a consumption tax. So we're literally taking money out of consumers' pockets as they buy imported goods from China. I'd rather not put a consumption tax on, and I'd rather say, okay, you can buy these goods, we're bringing them in anyways, you're gonna buy them anyways, and then give the consumer more money to put in the economy to buy other things that are actually manufactured here in the United States that will create more jobs.
Okay, so let's come back to North America for a second. The U.S. is Canada's largest trading partner. We're very interested in this election. There's a lot riding on it. Some Canadians do believe, though, that the economic relationship between Canada and the United States has changed under President Trump. Certainly the tone has changed. How would you characterize the economic relationship between the two countries? And how do you see the U.S. election impacting that relationship going forward?
I think currently it's much more strained than it should be, or I would like it to be. As I said, I think that the U.S.-Canada border is an important border, and I would like to see goods, and I'd like to see goods and services flow across that border freely. That is an important border. It's connected in lots of different ways. It's connected by roads, it's connected by pipelines, it's connected by rail, and it's connected by air. We have lots of different ways to move goods across, and then it's connected by internet, as most borders are, so we can move technology back and forth. I think it's an important border to open up, and I think it's an important thing that the next administration, whoever he is, that we reestablish those relationships. I think having a very good trading relationship between Canada and the United States is important to both countries.
So the U.S. recently scrapped new tariffs on Canadian aluminum, but how concerned should Canadians be about U.S. protectionism going forward, particularly after the election?
Well, it's hard for me to answer. I mean, elections have consequences. They have, and it's not just a presidential election. We've got Senate elections and House elections, and it seems to me that there's a lot of volatility at this point in what the outcome will be in the Senate. The House probably not as much. And to the extent we get more and more change, I think positions will change. And it feels to me today as we sit here that we're gravitating towards more free trade, towards more open borders, to a more friendly relationship with our G7 allies and our G7 trading partners, of which Canada is one. So, and I would be supportive of that.
Okay, another pivot here. Obviously, the Canadian oil sands and the U.S. Shale industry have taken a beating this year. It's been a terrible time for industries on both sides of the border. What do you see as the outlook for energy in the United States?
Well, I think everyone's acutely aware there's a very large push in the United States at the state level, and it may become at the federal level for renewable fuels. So as we continue to see this push and we continue to see more and more electric vehicles and more solar panel mandates and more windmills in the United States, without a robustly expanding economy, the demand for oil has gone down. And so, there was even a, unique point in time during this crisis where oil traded at a negative value. Another one of these things that we'll talk about for years because, there was no place to store oil and there was no demand for oil because no one was traveling. No one is even getting in their car and go to work, let alone flying airplanes. So, as we've seen demand destruction in the energy area. And so the commodity price has reflected that. I think this is a permanent trend. I don't think this is a temporary trend. And even if we see more robust economic growth, we're seeing substantial investment in renewables in the United States, and you're seeing more and more legislation in Europe for them to be less dependent on carbon. And I think this is a trend that is going to be with us for the rest of our lives. So this is just one of these sort of natural realities of different commodity markets. The United States, 20 years ago was very dependent on coal for generating electricity, and now we are not dependent on coal whatsoever, and coal is becoming a bit of an obsolete feedstock in the electric utility world. Even even that world has switched to gas, but again, we've created so much additional gas by technology and fracking and the additional wells and the additional pipeline in the United States that even gas prices with the additional demand by phasing coal out, those prices have even gone down.
It'll be interesting to see how that transition risk plays out in the energy sector on both sides of the border. I do want to ask you a bit about banking regulation in the United States. Obviously, the U.S. market is the natural growth market for many Canadian companies, including Canadian banks. We've seen some of the post-financial crisis regulation rolled back under the Trump administration. What do you see as the future of banking regulation in the U.S.? Do you see more deregulation or less?
So the one big piece of deregulation done under the Trump administration, I'll remind people because I think it's important, was done, in the Senate with about 17 Democrats joining their fellow Republicans. So it was fairly bipartisan, and it was a regulation reform that took high touch regulation out of small and medium-sized banks, but still left very high touch regulation in for the biggest, most important banks in the country. And I thought that made a lot of sense. I was supportive of it, and like I said, we got quite a few Democrats to agree with that as well. It's not clear to me to where banking regulation is going. I more or less feel like it's in a fairly good spot right now. But again, these crises teach us a lot. And one thing we saw in March is, yes, after 2008, with all the reform that we did in the banking community worldwide, we forced a lot of activity out of banks, but that activity didn't disappear. We just forced it from regulated banks to unregulated entities, but the financing needs for that industry still existed. So the banks, even though they weren't in the industry directly, they were indirectly in the industry by financing the new companies, the unregulated companies that needed financing. And I think, the Federal Reserve saw that and knew that. The SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, actually released a white paper on that earlier this week, where they talked about the importance of short-term funding and short-term wholesale funding and how it affects not just the regulated banks, but all of the other industries that are dependent on the regulated banks to provide them short-term funding. So, you take something as simple as equity market making. The vast majority of equity market making is done by a handful of firms, none of which are banks anymore, but all of those firms need a lot of overnight funding. So I think we will naturally take a look at the unregulated industry that filled the void when the regulated firms were forced out, and that's going to be something to look at. But I sort of feel like we've learned that the banking industry is in a pretty good spot right now. The capital levels held up fairly well. The balance sheets held up fairly well. But the honest answer is no one really knows where we're going to go with banking regulation.
That's an excellent point you made about the rise of the kind of unregulated space and kind of the size and scope of those players and their importance to the system. We've talked about a lot of negative topics in the last during our interview, and obviously there's a lot of negativity around this election and also with an economic crisis. But I did want to ask you, before we get to the audience questions, what gives you hope for the future?
There's a lot that gives me hope. Like I'm very optimistic. You know, I think that we have learned so much about ourselves and so much about ourselves as a country. Look, we've also seen some of the bad marks. But we've been forced to confront the social injustice. We've been forced to confront the inequality. We've been forced to confront the voting issue. Look, the voter turnout this year could be something amazing. We may see a real voter turnout in this country. You know, the amount of advertising, the amount of involvement we've seen from every walk of life on getting people involved in just a simple act of voting is phenomenal. It really is. So getting people engaged, getting people involved, getting people to be concerned is really extraordinary. But if you think of what we've been through with a pandemic, with a shutting down of government, with a huge spike in unemployment, with people re-engaging, people trying to reopen their businesses, the amount of new entrepreneurship we're seeing in this country, people that were laid off from jobs, opening up their own new businesses, even if it's part of the gig economy, but figuring out a way to get back to work, they're going to figure out ways to open new businesses and new small businesses. I'm very optimistic that we as a country, we're going to do really well, and we're going to learn a lot from this, and we're going to come out so much stronger than when we went in. Look, you hate to have to go through these things, and you never want to go through them. But if you're going to have to go through them, the worst thing you could do is not get smarter and not get better having gone through. And I'm not worried about that. I think we're going to get smarter, we're going to get better, we're going to get more efficient, and we're going to solve some real fundamental problems in this country.
So we have a really engaged audience and they've sent in so many questions for you. We're going to try to get to as many of them as possible. This one came in several times, and it's a question of how Canada will be affected by the results of the U.S. election. Specifically, will Canada benefit more from a Republican or Democrat victory?
So it's hard for me to tell you point blank. What I would hope I would see, and I think this is very important, and I really do think this is very important. I would love to see very much the United States normalize and enhance, not even normalize, I'd like to see enhance relationships with our most important allies around the world. And there's no more important ally around the world than Canada. You know, we share as long a border with Canada as we do with anyone in the world. You know, it's our entire northern border is Canada. So that to me would be a very important step forward. And if we're going to deal with the really big fundamental problems of the world, if we're going to deal with combating the parts of China that we don't like, we're going to need the support of the G7. We're going to need the support of the United States and Canada and the UK and France and Germany and Italy working together as a unified group to take on China. No one country's going to take on China and get China to reform itself and be a good citizen individually. We're going to need to work together. So look, the one thing I would hope is that the US and Canada would come out of this with stronger relationships, better trading partners, and a shared view of where we want to end up.
So many audience members also sent in this question for you. What do you think will have more of an economic impact? COVID-19 or the U.S. election?
So, look, it's COVID-19. It's, you know, COVID-19 is so important. You know, think about, and I don't really want to think about it, but I think you have to think about if we go through a massive second wave here in the fall. You know, we've all been told that as it gets cold again, the virus will reunite. We've been able to be outside. We've even been able to open outside dining, you know, and be socially distanced outside and have some social interaction. As you can no longer be outside and you're forced to be inside and you're forced to be closer to each other, you There's all types of theories that the virus will reemerge. If we reemerge and have to go through any type of shutdown of the economy, the impact of the second wave will be much worse than the impact of the first wave. And the recovery will take so much longer because we are trying to turn around. So I think COVID is way more important than the election. Although elections are huge, it's hard to say anything's more important than the election, but it is more important.
So another question from the audience. Would you say that Donald Trump's tax cuts benefited Wall Street more than Main Street?
So this to me, I think, is completely misunderstood. People may say I'm biased in this one because I had a large hand in helping design them. But we also got some very interesting facts a couple weeks ago. Every 3 years, the Federal Reserve Bank does a consumer survey of United States consumers. And what they found over the last 3 years is that income in the United States went up around 5%, but income for the top earners actually was unchanged to down, and income from the bottom earners went up dramatically. And that statistic played out throughout the whole system. Those without a college degree did substantially better than those with a college degree. The net worth of the bottom quintile of households in the United States went up dramatically more. In fact, the top households didn't go up. Stock ownership for the bottom quintile went up 4 or 5%. So what we saw is that additional income get forced down into the lower income household earners in the United States. And we saw that through a couple ways. We saw it through change in tax rates. So we lowered rates. We also increased a lot of the important credits, child care credits. We increased the amount of child care credits. We increased the refundability of those credits, and we increased the eligibility of those credits. And then we did lower the corporate tax rate, which everyone thinks is a big, huge windfall to corporates. I don't really want to disappoint people, but the amount of money that we're talking about in lowering the corporate income tax rate, it's not substantial. Unfortunately, corporations don't pay that much tax in this country. Most of the tax is paid by individuals. You're talking about less than $100 billion in lowering the corporate income tax from 35% to 21%. And we know, based on $3 trillion of stimulus, $100 billion is not a lot of money in terms of the government. But what it did, it made the United States companies very competitive again. It allowed them to compete on a global stage. It allowed them to grow. We forced them to repatriate money back home. And when we did all those things, they started hiring people, and there was more and more competition for labor. So we saw wage growth in the United States. And that, to me, is everything we were trying to do. We were trying to get more money in the hands of lower income earners, and we were trying to raise wages. And I think both of those things were accomplished. It's unfortunate on every front that we ended up with this COVID crisis, because it would have been interesting to see what 2020 brought as the next year of the economic stimulus package.
I really like this next question from the audience. Given the unprecedented level of federal debt and the attendant service costs, what is your outlook for balanced budgets, infrastructure spending, and the social safety net in the United States?
So again, this goes back to my point before, that this idea that we can just keep deficit spending $3, $4, $5, $6, $7 trillion a year. And again, I'll reiterate, I'm all for these fiscal packages, because these are, once in 100 years. When you're fighting the once in 100-year issue, you've got to do it. But you've got to go back after the 100-year problem is over and relook at the United States budget, both on the expenditure side and on the revenue side. So I don't want to be a gloom and doomer, but the larger our deficit gets in the United States, the more we become dependent on foreign buyers of US Treasuries, because we cannot finance our own deficit, the more we're putting debt in the hands of people that could use it against the United States. So if foreign countries decide, A, they don't want to buy our debt and show up for an auction, it creates a problem. And even worse is they decide the debt that they own, they don't want to own anymore, and they turn around and sell it. we call it weaponizing the debt. Our debt is getting so large right now that it's getting easier and easier for foreign countries to have a outsized influence on the interest rate picture in the United States. And the ones that will suffer, unfortunately, are the US consumers. We have a lot of consumer lending and a lot of consumer borrowing that's pegged to those interest rates. So to the extent that you start having trouble borrowing money at the federal government, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but if it happened, you would see a dramatic shock to interest rates that consumers are paying for their student loans, for their housing loans, for their credit card loans, and all of a sudden you'd be taking all that disposable income out of the system because they need it to pay off their loans.
This next question from the audience was also very popular. We received different versions of the same question, and it really has to do with what happens if President Trump loses the election. What will the economic impacts be, particularly if he refuses a peaceful or orderly transition of power? People are concerned about civil unrest and the threat that might pose to the economy. What's your view on that?
Well, let me give you my view on the second part first. We are going to have a peaceful civil transition of power in the United States. It's what we do. It's who we are. And I don't think anyone should worry about that. I mean, we have a system of checks and balances. We have a Senate that unanimously voted that we're going to have a peaceful transition of power here in the United States. So of all the issues you can throw on the table, and there's an infinite amount of them that keep me up at night or I worry about, that's not one that I worry about.
So what do you worry about? What does keep you up at night?
So look, I am worried about small, medium-sized businesses in the United States, how we are going to help recreate the entrepreneurial spirit in the United States, how we're going to help these entrepreneurs, how we're going to help the travel, leisure, hospitality, entertainment business in the United States, how we're going to get them going, and how long does that take? Because a lot of their product is based on people being relatively densified and being in spaces together. So to me right now, I guess I could say it relatively simply, how are we going to get our unemployment rate down from 8.5% to something that I would consider manageable at the 4% or under rate? And that, 4 or 5% of the next people going back into the labor force, it's very hard to do without a real COVID cure.
So we have time for one last question from the audience, and it's, what will the impact be on the global economic recovery if populism and this type of go-it-alone attitude continues to prevail?
So look, I don't think it would be great in any way, shape, or form. I mean, this go-it-alone populism, tax the wealthy, it's got a bunch of unintended consequences. And remember, we have it at two different levels in the United States. We have it at the state level and we have it at the federal level. At the state level, what we're finding out, in many respects, is people can choose to leave a state. So we've got some high tax states and we've got some low or no tax states. And we're seeing high tax states lose residents. And once you lose that resident and that resident goes to a low or no tax state, it creates a real hardship in that state. So the populism showing up in the state governments and the state legislators is going to create real havoc in these states as they force people out of the state and they force them to other states. And that's a real reckoning that's going to have to be dealt with. I don't think anyone wants to really leave these states, but when they look at the sort of opportunity cost to be in state A versus state B, they're making financial decisions. At the federal level, look, the federal government has a little bit more operating space because you're a federal taxpayer, you're under the federal laws no matter where you are in the United States. But again, I think people have to be careful because, we do have elections every 2 years in this country, and people's emotions swing pretty hard and pretty quickly, and we've seen that. We see the House change and we see the Senate change, and they change based on, how they're feeling, and probably the most important vote historically, it may not be during COVID, but historically is, am I better off today than I was 2 years ago when I voted? And if people don't think they're better off, they tend to vote for the challenger, not the incumbent. So we have these 2-year checks and balances here in the United States, and people will use the fact that they don't feel better off. And as I said before, we're doing a very good job of getting more people into the voting system, more and more people registered, more and more people educated about voting, and that means more and more people can use the system to voice A, their satisfaction, hopefully, or B, their dissatisfaction.
That's a wonderful place to leave it on the possibilities of the American democracy. Thank you so much, Gary, for your insights today on the U.S. election and the economic impacts. We really appreciate you being so generous with your time. A big thank you to everyone in the audience who tuned in, and we'll see you for part 3 of the U.S. election dialogues on October 29th. Bye from the Globe and Mail.